Moreover, as some in the audience is well aware, I am a Texan by choice, not birth. Instead, I hail from Long Island, New York, the birthplace of Theodore Roosevelt, whose dynamic speech on citizenship is the inspiration for today's discussion. Now, I know that Theodore Roosevelt is not fondly remembered by much of the conservative movement, probably not by most in this audience, but I find him captivating nonetheless. He is, in fact, one of my favorite presidents in United States history. There's something unapologetically American about his outlook on politics and life that can be respected. Likewise, his understanding of the role of citizens within democratic government gave at least one young conservative, me, an important lesson on the necessity of liberty-minded think tanks in the fight against government overreach, even if Teddy's grasp of proper limits on the role of government could use a little bit of work. I see that same spirit embraced by the Texas Public Policy Foundation in its legislative outreach, as well as its emphasis on personal responsibility. Accordingly, on a personal level, I am most grateful for the opportunity to introduce a man who appreciates the virtue of Theodore Roosevelt as well and can help clarify his legacy just a little bit. Before we begin, however, a couple of housekeeping items. First, I kindly ask that you and all audience members please turn off your cell phone, or at the very least, put it into silent mode. Second, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the National Review Institute, or NRI for short. While you're probably familiar with National Review magazine, you may not be familiar with National Review Institute, the 501c3 nonprofit organization founded by William F. Buckley in 1991. NRI's mission is to preserve the legacy of William F. Buckley, Jr., promote conservative principles he championed throughout his lifetime, and complement the editorial mission of National Review. Through NRI's policy fellowship, regional partnership events, NRI on campus, and other national programs, the Institute synthesizes the best thinking on how to guard and build our country's strengths and add to the vigor and practical application of our conservative convictions. With that said, Pete Hegseth is a Fox News Channel contributor, appearing regularly as a correspondent and guest host for the network's morning show, Fox and Friends. He's also a frequent contributor to foxnews.com and National Review Online. Pete is an Army veteran of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and was also a guard at Guantanamo Bay. He holds 2 Bronze Stars and a combat infantryman's badge for his time in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2012, Captain Hegseth deployed to Afghanistan with the Minnesota Army National Guard, where he was the senior counterinsurgency instructor at the Counterinsurgency Training Center in Kabul. Before that, First Lieutenant Hegseth deployed to Iraq with 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division for their 2005-2006 tour, serving as an infantry platoon leader in Baghdad in 2005. A year before that, 2nd Lieutenant Hegseth served in Guantanamo Bay with his New Jersey Army National Guard unit from 2004 to 2005. Pete was recently promoted to the rank of Major and is currently in the Individual Ready Reserve. Pete is the former CEO of Concerned Veterans for America, where he built the largest conservative veterans advocacy organization in America and led the charge for real reform at the Department of Veteran Affairs. Before that, he was the executive director of Vets for Freedom, leading the ground truth charge for success on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan. Pete graduated from Princeton University in 2003 with an undergraduate degree in politics. A decade later, he completed a master's in public policy at the Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, graduating in 2013. He and his wife, Samantha, live in Minnesota and have 3 sons. Major?
I feel very at home I haven't spoken in any theaters where it says, "You will never surrender or retreat." I love that. I love it. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. It is wonderful to be here. People probably say this all the time, but I love coming to Texas. It's like America still lives in Texas. You know, and I've got 3 little boys in Minnesota. We live on 5 acres in the middle of nowhere, where we have weapons that the left calls assault rifles, right? But they're not really assault rifles. But I named my 3 little boys Gunner, Boone, and Rex. Good Southern names. I don't know why I live in Minnesota, but I want them to, the values I want them to live and be infused with are in many ways values that are still, thankfully, collectively instructed here in Texas, and I'm doing the best to incubate them up in Scandinavian Lutheran Minnesota, of which I am both. So thank you very much for having me. I also want to thank the National Review Institute for co-sponsoring this event along with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. NRI does great work. Lindsay Craig, who runs it, is a friend, a former colleague as well. And I also want to recognize Jack Fowler, who's here. Jack, raise your hand, I'm going to embarrass you. Jack's the publisher of National Review. So the man who makes that magazine tick and talk is Jack Fowler. And thank you for all the opportunities you've afforded me, sir. And you can swamp him afterwards with all your questions about what it's been like to be at National Review over the last, say, 6 months, as they've been a massive part of the conversation in an incredibly constructive and thoughtful way, in my opinion. And then I also want to recognize Jim Hornfisher. Jim, where are you at? Right in the back. Jim is and was my literary agent for this book. So Jim helped me think through how to frame it and where to go with it. And I remember the phone conversation we had where the light bulb went off, that it's the Teddy Roosevelt speech that we need to use as the frame for this. And it rolled from there. And then I got to sit in my office for 6 months from 4 to 8 a.m. and try to write the book, which is ultimately what the process was. But thank you all for taking time to be here. I'll go briefly and then we'll open it up for Q&A on any particular topic. But when I set out to write the book, I wanted to, first of all, 2 points of clarification about it. First of all, the book's not about me. It's not a biography. I'm not audacious enough to believe that at the age of 35 I should be writing a biography. We'll leave that to state senators from Illinois who go on. So the book uses some stories about my life, but it's not about me. Secondly, the book is not about Teddy Roosevelt. It's not an argument for or against Teddy. Whenever I speak to conservative audiences, I always lead with that disclaimer. I have very clear eyes about the legacy of Roosevelt, his descent into progressivism, his bull moose candidacy, the founder of the Progressive Party that gave us the disaster that was Woodrow Wilson. To say that he failed while daring greatly is to say it lightly. So I come at him in that sense, but I think there's so much America today could learn from the ethos of Teddy. It's the bike helmet, ribbon, 5th place trophy culture. Could use a little bit of rub some dirt on it, strenuous life, Teddy Roosevelt. That is something we are stripping out of the next generation and have to be intentionally fortified and infusing if we're going to have the citizens that this great republic requires. So, which brings me back to the premise of the book. The title of the book, In the Arena, comes from a famous quote many of you might be familiar with, the man in the arena quote by Teddy Roosevelt. It's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out where the doer of deeds could have done them better or where the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly for worthy causes. And it goes on and ends with, so that your place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. And I printed it out and I literally carried it with me in Guantanamo Bay and Iraq and Afghanistan, and I always put it up wherever I slept or wherever I worked as a reminder. Is my face marred by sweat and dust and blood? Am I striving valiantly? Am I in the arena? Am I getting after it? And it just motivated me. And then after Afghanistan, I actually read the entire speech it came from, which I probably should have done sooner. And it was called Citizenship in a Republic. And Roosevelt gave it in 1910, after his Republican presidency and before his progressive candidacy, after his year-long safari. If you remember, he took an intentional hiatus from politics, and he was coming through Europe and was the man of the hour and the American celebrity, and his crowning address was the address at the Sorbonne, which is the University of Paris in France. So it's before he'd come back home, and he spoke at a theater built for 1,000 that was packed with 3,000 people, French elites of the day, and that speech was breaking news as far as you could have breaking news in 1910. It was reprinted in the New York Times in full, page 7 and 8, and across America as well as across France. So what the world wanted to and was ready to hear what Teddy Roosevelt had to say, the exemplar of America. And in my opinion, he did not disappoint. And in some ways, it was an un-PC speech before there even was PC. It was just kind of the basic, gritty building blocks of what great republics require. And his thesis is very simple, as oftentimes the most important and profound truths are. More simple than the intellectual left would want you ever to believe is possible. But for a great republic to remain great, average citizens must be good citizens. That's it. It's not that great rulers won't save us. Great citizens are not possible. We're all fallen, flawed human beings. It is the good citizen who understands where their rights come from, understand the nature of the exceptional nature of the republic that they're in, doing their duties every single day that perpetuate a great republic. And he's looking out at a French audience of elites and intellectuals, many of which have already started abandoning that principle. And in some ways, some of the news coverage at the time sort of talked in a sentimental way about how it was almost an echo from the past to this French audience. And so chapter 2 of the book is comparing France's great republic to ours. Now, very big differences between our foundings, which have massive implications going forward. But they didn't learn the lessons of Roosevelt's speech. And if America doesn't learn them quickly or relearn them, then there's no reason why we can assume that the 21st century will be an American century. And that is a profound statement when you think about it. Because if it is not an American century, what does it look like? After World War II, our British friends took a knee, exhausted after a couple of wars, and effectively handed us the keys to the free world, their younger brother, and said, it's yours. And through the Cold War and post 9/11 and everything, that is something responsible we've taken seriously. If we take a knee, either intentionally or unintentionally, who do we hand the keys to? Great, that looks like a free century. So if the 21st century is not an American century, it will not be a free century, which is another thesis of the book. And it's true if you look around at the trends of history and where we are going. And I think, again, looking to Teddy Roosevelt's speech and an example is a great roadmap for how we could. I mean, the 20th century, in many ways, may not have been an American century if not for Teddy Roosevelt. From his view of America's leadership role in the world. So the book is broken down into sort of a domestic aspect and international aspect. But on the international stage, I mean, this is the guy who talked about speaking softly and carrying a big stick. He sent the Great White Fleet around the world in 1907 in a demonstration of U.S. power. He was the chief agitator for American involvement in World War I. When Woodrow Wilson proclaimed we could have peace without victory. Sound familiar? The same types of arguments are being made and played out today. Teddy was an agitator to say he believed in America's principles, believed them to be special. We should be proud and unapologetic about them and be unafraid to lead in the world. So I think as he was speaking to that audience, he was speaking to an audience that in my mind and in his had a temptation to believe that history was over. That the big questions have been answered. And that's exactly what we see in Western Europe today, right? I mean, effectively, the experiment of Western Europe, or of much of Europe, has been what happens if and when we gut our militaries to pay for our welfare states, we open up our borders, and we don't demand assimilation or allegiance. What do we get? And it gets precisely what Teddy Roosevelt warned against, and what we've seen play out, unfortunately, through the acceleration of these dynamics through the migrant crisis and the refugee crisis we see in Europe, and the open borders, and ultimately manifests itself in the Brexit vote, which I'm sure you were is there going to be a Texit vote? Okay, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. Maybe this is a sore subject. I don't know the dynamics, but that vote was a manifestation of a lot of those sentiments and people saying, we reject this particular experiment. So guarding against that view of the world, Roosevelt talks about two different types of people and places in the speech. One, he talks about good citizens here at home and good patriots abroad. You can't if you don't fortify citizenship and why America is exceptional here, then you can never fortify our ability to project power and defend ourselves around the globe. In fact, Osama bin Laden knew that about us, right? That we were a paper tiger, or he believed that about us, that if you bleed or you put enough doubt into the minds of Americans, they will flee from the battlefield, that's their weakness, is their domestic front. And I can talk a little bit more about what it was like to advocate for the Iraq War in 2007 in some of the darkest, deepest days. But pushing through that internal resistance in a democracy to say we quit in a difficult war is what gave us the opportunity in the surge to actually win that war. And that's another conversation to be had and a question I'm happy to talk more about. But Roosevelt talks about good citizens here at home. And he doesn't, when you think of citizenship, what plays out on your TV? Everyone thinks about voting, or they think about protesting or marches and all the public facing. He says the word he uses for citizenship is efficiency. Probably not a word you would expect. I think of starting pitchers or light bulbs when I think of efficiency. not citizenship. And what he meant is doing what you can where you can, affecting your spheres of influence as a good citizen. And it had 4 basic ingredients that Roosevelt believed a good citizen should have. One, the willingness to earn a living, the ability to just earn a living, the virtue of work, which is something we understand, but in our society, we've ripped out of people in creating a dependency culture. He talks about shame should be had for those who, if they're able, are unwilling to work, as opposed to what we've done in getting people addicted on dependency and on government. It is the willingness and virtue of in his time, a man to provide for his family, and the homely virtues of the home combined to provide for a life for your family and those you love. The second is a willingness to fight. A willingness to fight for what you believe in your sphere of influence or by force of arms if necessary. A free people, unwilling to fight, eventually give up that freedom. And he argued that fighting spirit has to be maintained amongst free peoples. Otherwise, it's not invading armies that usually take away our liberties. It's the death by 1,000 cuts of our culture or of our policy or of agitators who slowly take them away while we're asleep at the wheel. The third aspect is large, healthy, patriotic families. Turns out demographics really do matter. Wow, that's a passé, politically incorrect thing to say that having large family is a good thing. Well, it is. And I was woken up to this in a common sense way in Afghanistan. I had a late night conversation. They used to tell us, don't talk religion with the Afghans. And I was like, what the hell else are we going to talk about? I mean, no, really, it controls, it is the lens through which they see the entire world. So as a Christian, when I'm a person of the book, we can have that conversation and relate and talk. We would have long late night conversations. And he was not a radical, just a regular 19-year-old kid, lives in America today. I helped him get here because I would trust him with my life and he with mine, and he was an amazing individual. We were having late, and he said, Pete, it's inevitable. Islam will rule the world. The prophet foretold it. We're having 10 kids. You're having 1. Do the math. And that is not from a radical to the ears of radicals. That is just the way that culture and that religion promulgates. And you look at Western Europe, where they're barely replacing themselves, and they've effectively declared themselves a museum. That museum is now welcomed a lot of new visitors who are having 5, 6, 7 kids. That's why, you probably know this already, but the most prominent boy's name in London today of a newborn is Muhammad. That was as of 2008. And on the statistics, if you actually take the different spellings of Muhammad, they're doing that based off this. You add up the 3 different spellings of Muhammad, and it's like 3 times the most popular boy's name in London today. That's not going to change. That won't be reversed. London hasn't fortified itself. That's the direction it's headed. So Roosevelt talked about that. Free people must be willing to perpetuate themselves and infuse that next generation. I keep trying to convince my wife to have number 4, but she gets a vote, She's amazing, but it also, what Roosevelt talked about in the speech was the humility that kids infuse because they're complicated and they're messy and they're difficult and they make you run home more quickly than you want to and they prevent you from doing all the things that you want to do. He said it's an incredible check on this sort of inward-facing selfishness that we all have, the tendency that we have as individuals, our kids, who force you to engage with life on terms that you maybe don't always want to engage with it. And then the fourth aspect, which could or should be the first, is character and faith. If free peoples if you don't have a moral compass that guides your own life, then the Leviathan of big government is necessary. Then someone tells you how you ought live, as opposed to you having that conviction. So if we ever wonder why we're off the rails as a nation, the minute you tear God out of school, out of the public square, out of all aspects of life, we wonder why the underpinnings of what makes America special start to erode away. And that is what it comes down to in that fortification process. Are we preparing the next generation to stand up for the word exceptionalism? Recapturing the word exceptionalism. Because America is not exceptional. That word, we're proud, we're boastful, we're wealthy, that's what American exceptionalism is all about. Wrong. American exceptionalism is just a mere recognition that what we have in this country is special, is unique. In the course of human history, less than 1% of anyone who's ever walked on this earth has ever lived free. The vast, overwhelming majority have lived under tyrants or kings or dictators or theocrats, or if they voted in an election, it was a sham election. I mean, this is truly the exception to the human rule. This idea that rights are endowed on us by a creator, not by government, was a fundamental transformation of the view of power in the social construct, social contract. And it is an understanding our founders had that each generation has to infuse and remind, lest we start to give it away to the inevitable temptation and easier arguments that the left oftentimes has to offer. Which is why when you try to fortify that exceptionalism, our educational institutions are the most important aspect of that. Abraham Lincoln once said, the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of government in the next. Why else do we get throngs of young people cheering for socialism? Because they haven't been fortified where they are to believe in the basic ingredients of free enterprise, or the basic ingredients of individual responsibility. And if they're made to have to engage with them, well then now they get to retreat to a safe space where they don't have to hear the arguments of the other perspective. That is only the tip of the iceberg. We laugh at the stuff we see in our college campuses, but it is the trend line of our nation and of our nation's voters, we are utterly unpreparing for citizenship. It's not that we're not preparing there to be conservatives or even Republicans. That's almost gone in a certain sense. Just a citizen of a pluralistic society who can have strongly held beliefs and engage in discourse and disagreement and still perpetuate this American experiment. We're not even, that's where I think, in part what the argument of the book is we have to, that's the argument we need to be having. We need to be reminding people of just the basics of citizenship and engagement. I used to send my kids I went to public school in Minnesota 25 years ago when you could assume that just the basic values would be absorbed or perpetuated. And I'm of the belief that accepting for, and this is not even pointing at teachers or principals who wish to do the best by their students, we can't take for granted any longer that those same values are being infused, even in nice, good, modern, suburban high schools across Texas or Minnesota or elsewhere. The left-wing liberal ideology that is being rammed down the throats through curriculum of our kids in so many places is changing the view that they have of themselves. And that gets me to the second point of the book, which is good patriots. Our kids today, our graduates, are being taught that they are citizens of the world, not citizens of America. That is their fundamental allegiance. Turns out Teddy Roosevelt in 1910 warned against these citizens of the world, who he said are utterly undesirable citizens of their own country because they love the abstract of humanity more than they do their work or their family or their community or their church. It is the intentions for humanity that guide their viewpoint as opposed to their engagement with the other around them. The reason we see the foreign policy we see today in the world is that we have been governed by and led by the first president of the United States ever to see himself more as a citizen of the world than as a citizen of the United States of America. That has led him to his belief that America isn't special, that America should apologize, that our sins of the past are more important to emphasize than the virtues or things we can add going forward. When you start to understand that that's how he sees us, a lot of it starts to make sense. People ask, is it incompetence or is it ideological? And my argument is that it is both. He both has almost no experience whatsoever doing anything on that type of scale, and ideologically is completely dedicated to a leveling effect for the United States of America across the globe. You see, he went to Ivy League schools along with John Kerry and everybody else in that administration, and in those ivory towers, they were baptized in that Blame America First viewpoint, baptized in that citizen of the world viewpoint. I call it their coexist foreign policy. I bet in Austin you've seen a few of those purple coexist stickers. Does it make you throw up in your mouth just a little bit? It does for me, and I'll tell you why. Because coexisting in and of itself is not bad. Of course you coexist. We all coexist on a daily basis in a pluralistic society with people we don't agree with, different faiths, different backgrounds. Coexisting is a means, not an ends. When you make coexisting your ends, you start coexisting with utterly radical viewpoints. It's the same as engagement. You know, Barack Obama was asked what his foreign policy doctrine is by the eminent Thomas Friedman of the New York Times. And he said, we will engage and preserve our core capabilities. That's his, by the way, he's gutting our military, so he hasn't done the second part. But we will engage is his foreign policy. Again, engaging as a means is something we've always done. But if engaging is your ends, you get to a place where you're now better friends with only two countries in the world, Iran and Cuba, and all of your allies and anyone you've ever worked with in the past wonders where you are. This coexist foreign policy is grounded in that viewpoint that those are ends, not means. Except what happens when, instead of wanting to coexist, the Islamic State cuts off the heads of Christians? Or what happens when, instead of wanting to coexist, Iran still seeks to wipe Israel off the map and gain a nuclear bomb? Instead of wanting to coexist and hit a reset button, Putin wants to redraw the boundaries of Eastern Europe. Or instead of wanting to coexist, China builds artificial islands in the South China Sea from which to project power. At that point in their mind, it reads, does not compute. Because they say, well, wait, hold on, but we apologized. But I'm the new international progressive sage. I'm here to engage. I'm here to coexist. What do you mean? And that's when they're paralyzed by an inability to take the necessary steps decisively to do what would be needed to defend America or our interests. And I think the utter incoherence around that has led to the chaos in the world today. I think the Iraq War, everyone is afraid to talk about the Iraq War. No one wants to talk about the Iraq War, and no one talks about the Iraq War properly. But the Iraq War is the perfect lens through which to understand what American leadership could look like. And I even say that in the book. I said this is probably going to, maybe people need a trigger warning or whatever, but I don't know. The Iraq War is, I say again, I think the lens through which we should look at American leadership. Now, not today, after what Barack Obama has done with it, but we invaded successfully, wandered around in the wilderness there, not figuring out the insurgency, making a lot of mistakes in 2004 and 2005 and 2006. Then George W. Bush, in what I would argue is one of the most courageous decisions, certainly of my lifetime that I've seen, doubled down against the establishment view and the overwhelming anti-war view and said, I'm going to surge, I'm going to commit a new strategy, and I'm going to go into win. And I've never been more proud of a president than on January 10th, 2007, when George W. Bush surged there. And I'd served just before that. I had a chance to go back actually to Iraq twice with National Review as an embedded reporter to go where I had served and write about the transformation. And you know, there's no fundamental transformations over there. There are here, which is exactly what Barack Obama is trying to do to our country. You're never going to remake a country like Iraq. But what we did there with the security environment was nothing short of incredible. Utterly defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq, standing up institutions, training an Iraqi army that was prepared to at least be an ally. You're not going to create Jeffersonian democracy. And what I talk about there are the differences between Iraq and Afghanistan and all the complexities, and we need to have a more realistic lens of what's possible and all of those things. But we surged and showed resolve, and we won that war. And then Barack Obama looked in the eyes of the American people and said, Iraq is the bad war, Afghanistan is the good war. He retreated from the battlefield, and it utterly descended into chaos. And it's not just the retreat of troops, they diplomatically turned their back, they lied to everybody about it was a status of forces agreement, and all of those things were a reason for them to do what they always said on their college campus slogans they would do, right? Just end the war. Just end the war. Consequences be damned. Well, from those consequences, we now have ISIS, and we now have the greatest Islamic threat that we've seen ever. And then the other side of that coin and this other side of that sin is what they did in Afghanistan, which is cynically look the American people and our troops in the eye and say, we're going to surge in Afghanistan, but we're never going to give the troops, the generals, the amount of troops that they need, and we're going to tell the enemy when we're going to leave in the next breath, And then we've got no real understanding of the dynamics there and no intent to see it through. And you look at the memoirs of all the secretaries of defense from that time, they all point to it. It was a political, it was exactly what they needed to do politically. They needed a war to be for. So that was their good war to be for. Even though what's possible in Afghanistan isn't remotely close to what's possible in Iraq. And then they went to Libya and said, we're going to do the worst of both worlds. We're going to have all the intervention with none of the follow-through, which means they learned none of the lessons of the previous two wars and fancifully believed, well, if they're in charge, this is a new model of 21st century. In fact, that's what Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama both called it, a model for 21st century cooperation. So it's all bad, but it's all through that lens. What do we need to do? I mean, what we need to do is rebuild our military, utterly crush and defeat ISIS in a way that none of our leaders today are capable of. Stand by our allies, and there's a recipe of it's not a difficult recipe, and that's why. Well, it is in rebuilding a military that has been gutted. You can restore credibility and say America is back in a certain sense, but you can't immediately produce the captains and majors that you pushed out, or you can't immediately modernize the military that we've refused to modernize. So there are a ton of complications that come with that and vulnerabilities that we will live with, that we will reverberate on from this administration for years to come. So that's a quick overview of some of the arguments in the book. But what I hope to do with the book is to motivate, is to inspire, and to remind every generation that we need you in the arena, you, in your sphere of influence, what you can affect. The first thing is your work, your family, your conduct. Look, it's not look somebody else in the mirror, look at yourself in the mirror and say, am I doing what I can do? And then the arena doesn't have to be a rifle in Iraq and Afghanistan. The arena could be watchdogging the curriculum in your local school, which nobody does. Or it could be running for city council. Or it could be helping a local candidate, or starting a civic group that promotes observations of days that are long forgotten. Or volunteering at your church, or coaching a sports team. The types of things that forge the men and women, the citizens of the future that this republic are going to require. We all have that sphere of influence. No one can say the problem is too big. Because the problem is massive. And if you watch Fox and you do everything else, you look at what's going on in our country, it's enough to just go, what? Let's just gut our military and become an inconsequential welfare state already. It's the sentiment you want to have. But the argument of the book is, it is the good citizens in their everyday lives who fight for the ideals of this nation. That is the arena, and we can all be in it, and we can't afford to abandon it. Because I used to say to my kids, about my kids, a cozy platitude. I fought so that they don't have to, so that they could live in perpetual peace. And actually, it's a mindset that came about mostly after World War II, right? The World War II generation went out there, defeated the Nazis, and said, and they did in many ways give a lot of so much perpetual peace for people. But it's not true. And I don't say it anymore. What I say now is I fight knowing that my kids are going to have to as well. And maybe they'll carry a rifle, and I hope they do. But if they don't, I want them to carry the balance sheet of a capitalist or an entrepreneur, or be a clipboard of a patriotic reporter or an activist, or just a great father and husband and family and citizen. We have to infuse in them a love for this nation, or we give it away. And we forget that looking at the big stuff, that our great republic is preserved by our average citizens being good citizens in their conduct and in what they affect. And I think that's a message that can cut across lines. It's a message that can cut across a lot of the nastiness that we hear in our rhetoric. And when I saw David French call it a tonic, I kind of like that. So my mission has always been to try to motivate and inspire and remind, and it's merely standing, rather than write a book about this is what Pete thinks about the world, standing on the shoulders of a guy like Teddy Roosevelt, who revered Abraham Lincoln, who revered the founders, which is, the connection we all have to those basic timeless truths. I'm not saying anything that's new. It's just a reminder of the things that this nation was built on in the first place. So with that, I'll conclude and take any questions.
So as he stated, we've moved to the Q&A portion of our event. We have staff with microphones. When I call you, please do wait for the microphone. This way, people can hear you if we do any type of live streaming, and also just so the audience and up on the stage can hear. Please keep your your questions succinct and in the form of an actual question. I want to hear the uptick in your voice.
Real quickly, first I'd like to underscore your interest in education, and I just have been talking to some of the TPPS staff today about the fact I'm heading to Boston tomorrow for a week with my 2 grandsons to do the Liberty Trail, but to teach them. And grandparents often have the gift of time that parents don't have, plus they're in touch with the historical backgrounds. And so this is something that grandparents is a vacuum that I so hope that a lot of us begin to fill. But the work that I do is with American patriotic Muslims, the great people like Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, Dr. Kanta Ahmed, who are confronting the Islamists. And yet we're working in a climate where free speech is being attacked, not just the climate as far as the social acceptance of anybody who wants to discuss these issues, but an Attorney General at DOJ, and in fact U.S. attorneys in the field who are now linking quote inflammatory speech to possibly legally actionable speech. Our Supreme Court, even as it stands now, Justice Kennedy this last week, 2 of these opinions showed him reversing positions on federalism and places where we thought we could count on him. So even before a new president, we have a Supreme Court that is, without a Justice Scalia, very much a concern. When you go into talk to the Americans out in the heartland, in states, are you understanding that they get the fact that there's no arena if we don't have free speech? We're Europe, and if we don't have free speech.
Yeah, I think that your question speaks to, people often ask, why do evangelicals support Donald Trump? And it's exactly what you just articulated. Because the biggest threat to an evangelical is their ability to speak, their ability to have their religious liberty and their opportunity to speak their faith openly and publicly. And the stifling combination of that ideology, political correctness, has forced them to retreat. And Donald Trump, for better or for worse, has blown open that conversation. And they're saying that's a more immediate threat than many of the social issues that a guy who calls it 2 Corinthians probably isn't as in touch with. God bless him, but you know what I mean? They know he's not of that ilk, but they say, hey, he's going to allow me the space to do that. And I do think if we learn, there's many things we need to learn from Donald Trump and his candidacies, setting aside some of the inflammatory comments. If we don't find the moment now to stand up and be unapologetic and unabashed and unafraid to speak as necessary, then we will have missed a moment. Because now is the time to blow up the ridiculous places where their logic goes to and say, this is a First Amendment, this is a Second Amendment issue. Let's make the clear case of what it really is. Like on guns. We better make a due process argument time and time again, because if we don't, pretty soon the terror watch list becomes something very different than what it was originally intended to be, which oftentimes happens. That's the nose under the tent on these very fragile liberties that we have. You can imagine 2 justices and those Second Amendment rights are kaputs. 2 justices and those First Amendment rights look a lot different. So I do think we have to just be willing to stand up with courage, straight, and speak truth, knowing that the blowback will be strong and loud, but that means we're onto something. It means we're actually willing to speak that truth, and it means we keep going. And so what I talk about in the book too, the arena is a lonely place. It's a frustrating place. You will fail. Your motives will be impugned. You will be personally attacked, and then you will fail again, and then you will fail again. And what they count on is you to quit. You to say, it's just too hard, it's just too difficult, I just want to remain low key. And it has been that sentiment from people who feel like things are just kind of okay that have allowed us to get to the point that we're at. And now is the point where we have to be willing to stand up and say, yes, we believe in America. We believe America is, can you imagine that's where we're at right now? That's the contours of this election cycle. Do we have a country or do we not? Do we believe in America or do we not? That's literally when you've got John Kerry standing at a commencement podium saying, welcome to a borderless world. That is where they want to go. And that is, I think, properly said, that is our Alamo. This is what we're fighting for now. It's the very idea of the thing we've taken for granted. And it's those basic building blocks, which is why the work you do on radical Islam. I did a piece we talked about earlier where I went to the Somali neighborhood in Minneapolis, which is where the most fighters that have gone to fight with ISIS have gone from Minneapolis, which you wouldn't think so. But Lutheran Social Services brought in a bunch of refugees after their 1991 Civil War, which was done for the right reasons to help them. And what I discovered, and what we already knew, but I went out there with a camera and a microphone for Fox and Friends and did a bunch of interviews and ran into a couple of mosques, and that was all interesting. But is that the first generation that got here, most of them overwhelmingly don't speak English. So there's been no immediate assimilation of the folks that came here. In fact, a lot of them, as we talked to them on the street, had radios in their pockets listening to Somali radio. It was not as if there was an earnest attempt to be a part of the conversation here. And then their next generation is the second generation of the ones who don't know where their allegiance lies. So you've got an assimilation problem and then an allegiance problem where they're drifting and saying, well, this culture doesn't really accept me in Minnesota, or that's their view, and there's this coherent ideology that promises me something very special, and these propaganda videos are pretty seductive, and that's when you get the affiliations in the wrong direction. And we have to be willing to start just demanding that, and that's what Roosevelt did so well. It's a great quote. I can't quote it, but it's out there about America saying, we welcome any kinds, all kinds, but when you come here, you are an American. And that is not a race, that is not a religion, that is not anything other than a set of beliefs and ideals that we have always stood for here. And we have to be willing to stand up and say, we still believe in those beliefs. They're still the founding blocks of who we are. And I don't care what your skin color is or your sexual orientation or this or that. You gotta believe those things. That's the bugaboo for me. If you don't believe those things, then why are you here? Because that was the premise of this experiment in the first place. That's a hard thing, I think, for a lot of people's ears to hear, especially the multicultural sort of world that we live in. You can do that in a way that isn't bigoted or racist or hateful. It just says, I'm pointing at what I love. Karen Vaughn, Gold Star wife, has a great phrase. She says, I fight, my son, she lost her son in Afghanistan. My son didn't fight because he hated what was in front of him. He fought because he loved what was behind him. It's a perfect way to put it. I don't do what I do because I hate the other. I do it because I love what we have here. And it's worth passing to the next generation. And so now's the time to be unafraid and unapologetic in all of those spheres. Long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
Pete, thanks very much for your comments and the book. Churchill, channeling Roosevelt, said that American foreign policy failures can be summed up in 2 words: too late. We intervened too late. In your book, which I look forward to reading, would you agree with that? That we need a more robust intervention, right place, right time? And how do you think about a Trump presidency, whom I will vote for, which seems to be more nationalism, retreating back to our borders, as opposed to what Teddy and others would have advocated for robust intervention, right time, right place?
It's a great question. Was it Barry Goldwater in his nominating speech, or his acceptance speech at the convention? I think he said, extremism, defense of liberty is no vice. I've come to believe that nationalism in defense of America is no vice. Nationalism has always been seen as this dirty, nasty word, and of course there are contexts in which it is. But if you mean by nationalism defending what America represents, then we ought fight for it vigorously. The tension you described about this sort of America First view, which was of course the anti-war slogan, was it World War II, I think, slogan of Charles Lindbergh, which has this massive isolationist historical connotation, but is speaking to this idea that, listen, you talk on any grassroots event or folks amongst conservatives or Tea Partiers or Republicans, there is a sense even in those groups that America's been overstretched, America's been overengaged, America's tried to do too many things in too many places. We can't, that line, nation build at home as opposed to nation build over there, has resonance. I'm a believer in winning the wars that we fight, but I'm also a big believer in learning lessons from those conflicts and learning lessons about what is possible with human nature and nation building and other places where we thought we could do more than we could do and could affect, and we better learn about what is possible while also preserving the ability to do what is necessary. So, and what I mean by that is, I think the Iraq surge was the right thing to do because it was in our interest. I mean, George Bush said the battle on the streets of Baghdad, the future of America's security will be decided on the streets of Baghdad. And if we abandon it, we will get an enemy even worse than what we have right now. And it was perfectly prophetic because we retreated. So I think the other thing that David French speaks so well to, and I think is a huge part of that conversation, is the rules of engagement and the nature in which we fight wars today, which handcuff our ability to fight and win decisively in places where that is what's required. So if you were to say to me, I was a senior counterinsurgency instructor in Afghanistan. I could talk you back to front about insurgencies and counterinsurgencies and nature, all of that. We were tempted to want to apply that type of a prism in our military today to how we would affect or defeat ISIS, which is both an insurgency and a standing army. But what we need to do is utterly and ruthlessly crush them. But our rules of engagement are so that we can't even bomb the headquarters of ISIS in Raqqa, which we know the 10-digit grid coordinate to, because we're worried about the civilian casualties in the surrounding homes. Or we won't bomb the oil tankers that fund ISIS because we consider the driver of the oil tanker a civilian casualty. So instead we drop leaflets on them telling them we're going to bomb them in an hour. I mean, it's silliness what we're doing in light of these massive, crazy threats. And I think what Donald Trump has spoken to is this sense that our foreign policy intelligentsia always have these theories about what we're going to do, but they never have the gut to actually see it through. So we get all of the intervention with none of the outcome. That's foolish. And you know what? He's right in that sense. And as someone who's been probably more interventionist, more hawkish, I've eaten humble pie in the book, about what I think is possible or what we should be doing. Instead saying, okay, let's learn these lessons, but let's not have a conversation about whether America should lead. It's in what manner America should lead. Because if we don't, no one else will, and we've seen the chaos that results when we don't. So we have to be willing to intervene aggressively and decisively on behalf of our allies and our interests, knowing that whatever the tail is on that intervention, we better be prepared for. Because in Libya, the tail was chaos because we had no plan. In Iraq, it was a decade-long insurgency that we eventually got right. And in Afghanistan, it's sort of an endless war that really I see no good scenario in which that ends well. And yet, it's the one where we now have a residual force that we're probably going to keep at about 10,000 over due time. To what end, I'm not quite sure. As we tap dance around whether our drones can hit just ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but not the Taliban, so the Taliban's coming back, but like, aren't the Taliban's kind of friends with Al-Qaeda? And so it's this maddening mess of what do we do? That's where I think, so you asked about Donald Trump. I mean, I'm a never Hillary guy, and I just think that, and I was Rubio guy and then a Cruz guy and was all in for the both of them. But I think if Donald Trump can right the ship on his campaign, stick to core themes, surround himself with a cabinet, as he did with Supreme Court nominee picks that he's not nodded, then, I mean, he could be the horse for the moment. And if, I've said this before, if I can get a wall, a rebuilt military, and 2 or 3 good Supreme Court justices out of a Trump presidency, then we're all set. That's, to me, stems the tide of the moment that we're in, that Hillary Clinton will only accelerate. I mean, we are 2 Sonia Sotomayors or, Elena Kagans away from who knows what. So I think that's where we're at, and I do think it is, and he does speak to this idea, either we have a country or we don't, and people feel it slipping away. I just don't want, it can't become an isolationist moment, because we can't be. That's the tap dance, and I think that's where Teddy is useful. Because Woodrow Wilson was your international idealist utopian, and who said we should have the League of Nations, which would make America subservient to other countries, which is exactly what we have at the UN today, which is why I think we should say, just like the UK Brexited from the UN, why are we still nodding to the UN? Why? What interest do they currently serve us today? The alternative should be a proactive alliance of nations who share values and are willing to defend each other collectively if necessary. And even Donald Trump's critique of NATO. As much as I'm a believer of NATO, we can't just take institutions for granted and say because it once was useful, it will be useful in perpetuity. I think it's still useful, but there's no doubt the free rider effect of that alliance has created instances where our allies are utterly dependent on us. We spend on them, they can't help us, and it feeds their own welfare states that make them more irrelevant. So he's blown open some huge conversations that need to be had.
All right, although I see a couple of
I go too long
hands
with my
in the
answers.
air, we have hit time, but I definitely encourage us to continue the conversation in the foyer where books will be on sale for $23 a piece. But with that, please give a round of applause to our speaker. It was a great conversation, and we will definitely continue in the future.